Hello, everybody. This is going over the things that I just felt we needed to talk over more about 4.5 and 4.6. I'm going to rush through things pretty quickly because I'm trying to limit this to 15 minutes. And so, of course, if you have any questions, I encourage you to come in and ask, and so you can get a chance to figure it out for yourself and figure out what you need. Now, quickly to cover back the whole idea of one bank. If you have one bank, and you want to know what's going on in reserves and cash and all of these things going on. Let's assume in this case we have a bank in which we have, in this case, $140,000 in checkable deposits, but overall our reserves add up to $200,000. Notice that this means a lot of this might have come from cash, so in this case there would have been $60,000 worth of cash in this case. And so what you need to do is, of course, think about the reserve requirement. In this one, you can obviously tell that the reserve requirement is 10% because our required reserves are 10% of our checkable deposits of $140,000. So our reserve requirement times our checkable deposit ends up with what we've got here. Now our excess reserves, of course, would be our total reserves, which would be, in this case, $200,000, minus our reserve requirement of $14,000 equals our excess reserves of $186,000. This $186,000 is money that this bank can lend out. And of course, when it's lending it out, this bank can create new money, not simply transferring it, which is money that's subject to the multiplier. So if our multiplier is 10 in this case, as it would be, because if our reserve requirement is 10%, 1 over 0.1, which is the decimal form of 10%, would give us our multiplier of 10. If we went through the entire system, this $186,000 in reserves would end up being $1,860,000. Now, something else to note first, though, is while that is creating more money when somebody puts money into a checkable deposit, they are not creating more money. It is just going from one form of M1 to another form of M1. And so, when something happens, and another thing to note on the T-chart is when something happens on one side, it must happen on the other. So when deposits happen, if somebody were to deposit, for example, an initial $5,000, that would also then be credited on this side. So now all of a sudden we have $5,000 that would flow into the reserves. This would add on checkable deposits, bringing us up to $190,000. Our required reserves would go up to $19,000, but our excess reserves would also increase. Sorry, 145. 14,500 would be our required reserves. Now, the same is when something disappears. If somebody writes out a check for $5,000, that disappears from the liability because the bank no longer owes it to anyone, which is a positive for the bank, but on the other hand, that also disappears from the assets as well. So when something is withdrawn from the bank or deposited into the bank, it impacts both sides of this chart. Now, to look at checking for a second, let's take a quick second and look at check clearing. And so with check clearing, a good thing to note is how this check clearing works in the first place. Let's assume that your grandma gave you for your birthday a $100 check. And so, of course, the first thing you do with it, being a wonderfully responsible human being, is decide you're going to put that $100 in the bank, so none of your siblings or friends will try to take that money away from you. So, you take it to your bank, and let's say that you bank with Cherokee Bank. It's done, right? As far as you're concerned, that money's in your bank, and there's no problem at all. But there are other steps in the process, specifically for the banks, and the role that the Fed plays in this. So when you deposit a $100 check from your grandma at Cherokee Bank, your bank then scans that check. So they send it through a check reader, which you may have seen if you've gone to the bank, and that goes to the Fed. The Fed then will take that $100 and add it into Cherokee Bank's account. Because something to keep in mind here is that the Fed holds on to money for these banks. The reserves that they have, they give to the Fed. The Fed then, when they credit Cherokee Bank's account, that money has to come from somewhere. It comes from your grandma's bank. And let's assume in this case that your grandma banks at TCF. Then what the Minneapolis Fed does is they send that check to TCF so they can verify it. And then TCF will know that yes, this $100 has been withdrawn from our checkable deposits and is no longer a part of our account. There are other ways to look at this, and there are other slides in this. This is all from that wonderful Federal Reserve PowerPoint that is on the Moodle page, which can be a great resource for you to see how the Fed works and how all these different processes work in as well. All right, if we look back then at our bank, hopefully you understand how check clearing works a bit better. Bond purchases work differently than checking, because if a bank buys a bond from the Fed, it's not a deposit. That bond money goes directly into the assets category and does not need to appear in the liabilities category, because that is money that's just cash for the bank to use. The bank does not have to save a certain amount because it's not money that they will have to pay back to anybody except for the Fed, which is really nice for banks and why banks tend to like to loan from the Fed and why the Fed tries to discourage it too much. Notice, of course, if they loan out this $186,000 and somebody goes and pays back the loan, so they give all this money back to them, back to the bank, all that extra money that was created by the loan is destroyed. That money is constantly being created and destroyed at a very rapid pace throughout our economy, but because of the multiplier effect, overall the money that is created is greater than the money that is destroyed. But of course, if there's too much going on and not enough deposits or not enough reserves to back it up, the entire system can collapse like a house of cards, which is what can happen when you have multiple banks. But the multiple banks is also what allows the multiplier. If you only had one bank and people took it out and lent it from the bank, put it in the bank, lent it from the bank, put it in the bank, and so on and so forth, it would be a very long, arduous process. And then that bank would have nobody else to lean upon when somebody goes to repay their loan or goes in to take out a check. But having multiple banks to work with is what allows us to have the multiplier in the first place. All right, that was step one, just going through the banks again. Next, we're going to quickly go back through the tools of monetary policy again. And one of the things to note with monetary policy is that when they're doing this monetary policy, what they really care about is how they're impacting money supply. While fiscal policy cares about injecting it directly into GDP, it cares about spending, it cares about taxes, it cares about the money that people have directly in their pockets, monetary policy cares about the total amount of money in an economy, and that's how they impact it. And notice that monetary policy does not have as direct an impact on GDP as fiscal policy does. Now, of course, the reserve requirement gives them a wonderful way to influence banks and influence banks' behaviors. If you think banks are being too risky, you raise the reserve requirement. If you think banks are being too conservative in the way that they're lending out cash, you would then lower the reserve requirement. But usually it is a thing of last resort. Discount rates, of course, is what the Fed has, which is higher than the federal funds rate. But something to know about rates and interest rates is that they all will rise and fall together. What we're going to spend most of the rest of the time talking about, though, is open market operations, namely the buying and selling of bonds. Notice that with monetary supply, something that would be, in this case, expansionary is what we call an easy money policy. You make it easy for people to get money from the Fed, so you create more money, in this case. A tight money policy, you make it more difficult for people to get money, so the Fed will decrease the amount of money. If there's less money, it can slow down the economy. If there's more money, it can speed it up. So let's look at bonds. Now notice the Fed buying a bond is an expansionary policy, because of course when they buy a bond, they're putting that money out there that then is subject to the multiplier and can create more money. Notice it is not creating more demand that the multiplier is impacting, it is creating the money. So in this scenario, let's say that they have $1,000. If a bank buys a bond, that bank does not have to keep any of it in reserves for the first level of spending because that bank it's not in the checkable deposits. Nobody has loaned them that money. So this $1,000 then is all loaned out. In the next bank, when a person then puts that $1,000 in the next bank, then it starts to be subject to the reserve requirement. But if, in this case, you can tell the multiplier is 5, which means the reserve requirement would be 20%, so we end up with $5,000. Notice, on the other hand, if they give it to an individual person, and they put the money in the bank, now that bank is required to hold on to a portion of it as reserves, because they are eventually going to have to pay back what that person has put in the checkable deposits portion of the bank. So that bank then can only loan out $800. Of that $800, when you apply the multiplier of 5, you end up with $4,000 being lent throughout the entire system, and that's how much the money increases after the initial purchase. But the $1,000 bond also counts. So in this case, even though only $4,000 is added, the total increase in monetary money supply is still $5,000. And notice that the initial $1,000 counts here because when the Fed makes a bond, this is money that they have created. This is money that did not exist before, that the Fed is now adding to M1. So it's brand new money. It's not coming from anywhere else. 3 wonderful scenarios in this case then. A reserve requirement of 20%, 1 over 0.2, brings us a money multiplier of 5. So if the Fed buys $1 million in bonds from the trustee bank, that means they buy the piece of paper, give the money to the bank, and of course, then that bank, what happens? The increase in the money supply is $1 million. Now notice another thing here. How much can that bank create in loans? Nobody lent it to them in the first place. Nobody put it in a deposit, so there's no reserve requirement here, so they can loan out all $1 million of it. Because, of course, that's now subject to our multiplier of 5, our total addition in the banking system is $5 million, and then our total money supply is the total addition in the banking system here, which is also $5 million. And so this is what the Fed has created here. Now, if the Fed gives this to an individual, in this case Bill Gates, so a small little amount of $1 million, how much does that change M1? Well, it also changes it by $1 million. Because that's money that did not exist before. But because Bill Gates is putting it into his checking account, they have to hold some in reserve. So they can only then send out $800,000 of this. When $800,000 is subject to our multiplier of 5, our total increase is $4 million. So, of course, the change in the banking system is only $4 million, but this $1 million was also created in the first place. So our total change is $5 million, just like it was when the Fed buys a bond from a bank. So whether the Fed buys a bond from an individual or a bank, it will have the same impact on the money supply. It's just that the lending increase in the banking system is different here because that they must hold some in reserve when it's sold to an individual. Now, let's look at Bill Gates from another standpoint. If he has money in his piggy bank, so just $1 million laying around his piggy banks, he breaks it open, he thought, well, I guess I don't need this lying around too much. What happens to M1? The answer is nothing. It was in cash. Now it's in checkable deposits. So the money does not change. M1 does not change. But the bank still has $1 million. Because of the reserve requirement, then, they will start loaning it out, but can only loan out $800,000, just like when Bill Gates put the bond into the banking system. The entire impact here is also going to be $4 million, just like it was in the other Bill Gates category. But in this case, the money supply, there was no initial increase of $1 million in the money supply, so money supply here only increases by $4 million. My time is almost up, so I will leave you be for now. Hopefully this makes a bit more sense. Let me know if you have questions, and have a great day.